February 19, 1945. At 0200 hours, the volcanic island of Iwo Jima lay silent beneath a moonless Pacific sky, its black sand beaches undisturbed except for the rhythmic crash of waves against the shore. 8 miles of fortifications carved into volcanic rock formed what Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi believed was the most defensible position the Imperial Japanese Army had ever constructed. The general stood in his command bunker, 75 feet below Mount Suribachi, reviewing intelligence reports that estimated any assault would require at least 3 months to overcome his defenses, if it could succeed at all. He had no way of knowing that in exactly 36 days, the outcome would rewrite everything he understood about modern warfare. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What unfolded on Iwo Jima would transform from a battle the Japanese High Command considered mathematically impossible to lose into a demonstration of how industrial capacity, tactical innovation, and human determination could overcome seemingly perfect defensive engineering. The island that Japanese planners had declared impregnable would become something entirely different, and the methods that made the impossible happen would reshape military thinking for generations to come. Lieutenant General Kuribayashi was not a typical Japanese commander of the era. The 53-year-old cavalry officer had served as a military attaché in Washington before the conflict, traveled across America, and developed a deep respect for American industrial capacity. Unlike many of his contemporaries who dismissed American fighting spirit, Kuribayashi understood that Japan faced an enemy with resources beyond anything the imperial forces could match. This understanding shaped every decision he made in preparing Iwo Jima's defenses. Beginning in June of 1944, Kuribayashi oversaw the transformation of the 8-square-mile island into a fortress unlike anything previously constructed. 21,000 Japanese soldiers, sailors, and Korean laborers worked day and night excavating 11 miles of tunnels through solid volcanic rock. The general abandoned traditional Japanese defensive doctrine, which emphasized beach defense and honorable death charges. Instead, he designed a defense in depth that would turn every yard of advance into a grinding ordeal. The volcanic rock of Iwo Jima proved both blessing and curse. The soft stone could be carved relatively easily, but the sulfurous fumes from active volcanic vents made working conditions nearly unbearable. Temperatures inside the tunnels often exceeded 120 degrees Fahrenheit. Workers wrapped wet towels around their faces to breathe, and many collapsed from heat exhaustion. Yet the work continued relentlessly. Captain Tsunezo Wachi, a naval engineering officer assigned to the fortification project, recorded in his diary entries from September 1944 that the tunnel network was designed to allow defenders to disappear after firing and reappear elsewhere. Machine gun positions were connected by passages allowing guns to be moved to alternate firing positions within minutes. Artillery pieces were mounted on rails inside caves, able to roll forward to fire and roll back into protected positions before counter-battery fire could arrive. Supply rooms, barracks, hospitals, and command centers were all connected underground. The defensive positions were distributed across 3 main zones. Mount Suribachi, the 556-foot volcanic cone at the island's southern tip, contained positions that could bring fire on the landing beaches from elevated angles. The central airfield plateau held the densest concentration of defensive works, with hundreds of reinforced bunkers and pillboxes connected by tunnels. The northern sector featured a maze of rocky canyons and ridges that Kuribayashi believed would take months to clear, even if the southern positions fell. Kuribayashi issued strict orders that no soldier was to die uselessly. Every man was expected to take 10 American lives before his own death. Suicidal charges were forbidden. Defenders would fight from concealed positions, strike, disappear, and strike again. He calculated that if his 21,000 men each eliminated 10 enemies, the Americans would suffer 210,000 casualties, a price he believed impossible for them to accept. In the waters approaching Iwo Jima, a different kind of preparation reached its culmination. Task Force 58, the largest naval armada ever assembled in the Pacific, converged from bases across the ocean. 485 ships carried the 4th and 5th Marine Divisions, with the 3rd Marine Division in floating reserve. 70,000 Marines prepared for an assault against an island smaller than most American towns. Major General Harry Schmidt, commander of the 5th Amphibious Corps, studied reconnaissance photographs with growing concern. The images showed an island that appeared barren, with few visible defensive positions. Intelligence estimates suggested 8,000 to 9,000 defenders, perhaps 10,000 at most. What the photographs could not reveal was that 90% of the defensive works existed underground, invisible to aerial observation. The true garrison was more than double the estimate, and every defender was positioned in fortifications designed specifically to survive naval bombardment. Private First Class James Bradley of the 2nd Battalion, 28th Marines, wrote a letter to his family on February 18th that captured the mood aboard the transport ships. The young Navy corpsman described how Marines checked their equipment with unusual thoroughness, how conversations seemed more serious than before previous landings. Rumors circulated that this operation would be different, harder than Tarawa or Saipan. Nobody yet understood how much harder it would prove. The preliminary bombardment began on February 16th and continued for 3 days. Battleships, cruisers and destroyers fired more than 21,000 shells at the tiny island. Carrier aircraft dropped thousands of bombs. Navy officers watched through binoculars as explosions carpeted Iwo Jima with smoke and flame. It appeared nothing could survive such devastation. Admiral William Blandy, commander of the bombardment force, reported that the island had been neutralized. He was catastrophically wrong. Inside the tunnels, Kuribayashi's men endured the bombardment with minimal casualties. The general had forbidden construction of any above-ground structures except where absolutely necessary. When shells hit, the explosions occurred on the surface while defenders waited safely below. Small observation posts allowed Japanese spotters to track the bombardment and report back through telephone lines buried too deep for the shelling to cut. The Americans were destroying an empty landscape while the garrison remained intact. Dawn broke on February 19th, with the sky clear and the sea relatively calm. At 0640 hours, the naval bombardment resumed with renewed intensity. At 0830, the bombardment lifted to allow carrier aircraft to strike positions further inland. At 0900 hours, the first wave of Marines climbed down cargo nets into landing craft that would carry them toward the black volcanic sand beaches. 70 landing vehicles tracked, carrying the initial assault waves, churned through moderate surf toward shore. Marines gripped their rifles and stared at the island growing larger ahead of them. The volcanic cone of Mount Suribachi dominated the southern skyline. No enemy fire greeted the approaching craft. The beaches appeared deserted. Some Marines dared to hope the bombardment had done its work. The landing craft ground onto the steep volcanic sand at 0902. Marines poured out and immediately discovered the first challenge that would plague the entire operation. The volcanic ash beach rose at a 15-degree angle and consisted of fine particles that shifted under every step. Men sank to their ankles with each stride. Equipment became exponentially heavier. Vehicles bogged down immediately. What should have taken seconds to cross took minutes of exhausting struggle. For almost 30 minutes, the Marines pushed inland against no opposition except the treacherous terrain. Units began to organize, thinking perhaps the bombardment had indeed neutralized the defenses. Then, at precisely 0932, Kuribayashi gave the order to open fire. The island erupted. Artillery shells from positions on Mount Suribachi and the highlands began landing among the crowded beaches. Mortar rounds dropped with precise accuracy, their firing positions pre-registered on every yard of sand. Machine guns opened from concealed positions in the rocks above the beaches. The Marines suddenly found themselves trapped on a killing ground designed over 8 months of meticulous preparation. Sergeant John Basilone of the 1st Battalion, 27th Marines, had survived Guadalcanal and received the Medal of Honor for his actions there. On the morning of February 19th, he led his machine gun section across the terraces of volcanic sand toward a Japanese blockhouse. Witnesses later reported he moved with absolute calm despite the intense fire, encouraging his men and directing their advance. He was moving to flank a pillbox when an enemy shell landed directly on his position. The Marines had lost one of their greatest legends within the first hour of the assault. Despite the devastating fire, the Marines continued to push forward. The training that had been drilled into them took over. Small unit leaders directed their men toward specific objectives. Combat engineers moved forward with explosives to attack the bunkers that revealed themselves with muzzle flashes. Flamethrower teams crawled close enough to direct streams of burning fuel into firing apertures. Tanks struggled through the sand to bring their main guns to bear on defensive positions. By nightfall on the first day, 30,000 Marines had landed on Iwo Jima. They held a beachhead approximately 1 mile wide and 1,000 yards deep at its furthest penetration. The cost had been devastating. More than 2,000 Marines were casualties, with over 500 confirmed dead. Hospital ships offshore rapidly filled with wounded. The assault had achieved its initial objectives, but every commander who reviewed the day's action understood they had encountered something unprecedented. The Japanese were not simply defending their positions. They were executing a carefully orchestrated defense that used the terrain and prepared positions with deadly efficiency. Private First Class Donald Rule of the 3rd Platoon, Easy Company, 2nd Battalion, 28th Marines, spent the first night huddled in a shallow hole scraped from the volcanic sand. Japanese infiltrators probed the Marine lines throughout the darkness, and occasional artillery rounds screamed overhead to burst among the crowded troops on the beach. Rule and his fellow Marines took turns on watch, knowing that the morning would bring renewed assault toward the looming mass of Mount Suribachi. The battle for Suribachi began in earnest on February 20th. The 28th Marines, commanded by Colonel Harry Liversedge, received the mission to isolate and capture the volcanic cone. Intelligence estimated perhaps 300 Japanese defenders held the mountain. The actual number was closer to 2,000, positioned in defensive works that honeycombed the interior of the volcano. The advance toward Suribachi proceeded yard by bloody yard. Each pillbox had to be identified, approached under fire, and destroyed individually. The standard technique involved infantry suppressing the position with rifle fire, while a demolition team crawled close enough to place explosives against the firing ports. Flamethrower operators sprayed burning fuel into openings. Tank main guns fired point-blank into embrasures. Even after a position seemed destroyed, Marines often found another firing port opening from a different angle, connected by tunnels to the same defensive complex. Corporal Tony Stein of Company A, 1st Battalion, 28th Marines, had fabricated a custom weapon from an aircraft machine gun salvaged from a damaged plane. The weapon could fire over 800 rounds per minute, but consumed ammunition at a prodigious rate. On February 20th, Stein made repeated trips back to the beach to obtain more ammunition, carrying wounded Marines on his return journeys. On his 8th trip forward, he personally destroyed multiple defensive positions, allowing his platoon to advance. His actions that day would earn him a posthumous Medal of Honor after he was lost in action on March 1st. By February 23rd, after 4 days of continuous assault, Marines of the 28th Regiment had fought their way to the base of Suribachi's summit. Colonel Liversedge ordered a patrol to determine if the top could be reached and secured. First Lieutenant Harold Schreier led 40 men from Easy Company up the slopes in the early morning, expecting to encounter fierce resistance. They found the summit largely abandoned, the defenders having been systematically eliminated or forced to retreat into the lower tunnel systems during the preceding days of close combat. At 10:20 hours on February 23rd, Schreier's patrol raised a small American flag on a piece of pipe found among the rubble on Suribachi's summit. The flag was visible from portions of the battlefield below, and its appearance triggered an eruption of cheering from Marines who could see it. Ships offshore sounded their horns. The flag represented the first major objective secured. Secretary of the Navy James Forrestal, observing from the command ship offshore, declared he wanted the flag as a souvenir. 2nd Battalion Commander Lieutenant Colonel Chandler Johnson, learning of this, decided the historic flag should remain with the battalion. He ordered a larger flag brought from a landing ship and sent to the summit with instructions to replace the first flag and bring the original back. This replacement raising, photographed by Associated Press photographer Joe Rosenthal at approximately noon, became one of the most iconic images of the entire global conflict. The photograph captured 6 Marines driving the pole into the volcanic rock, their bodies straining against the weight and wind. 3 of those 6 men, Sergeant Michael Strank, Corporal Harlan Block, and Private First Class Franklin Sousley, would be casualties within days. The image, transmitted around the world, provided a powerful symbol of American determination. Yet for the Marines still fighting on Iwo Jima, Suribachi's capture represented merely the completion of the first phase. The bloodiest fighting still lay ahead. While the 28th Marines fought for Suribachi, the other assault divisions pushed north across the island. The 4th Marine Division on the right flank and the 5th Marine Division on the left encountered the main defensive belt protecting the airfields. Here, Kuribayashi's defensive philosophy reached its fullest expression. Bunkers built of reinforced concrete with walls 5 feet thick absorbed direct hits from naval guns without significant damage. Pillboxes positioned for mutual support meant that attacking one brought fire from 2 others. Artillery positioned in caves fired on pre-registered coordinates and withdrew before counter-battery fire arrived. The terrain itself became an enemy. The central plateau consisted of broken ground where every ridge and depression hid defensive positions. The soft volcanic sand absorbed the explosions of artillery and mortar rounds, reducing their fragmentation effect, but making the ground even more difficult to traverse. Vehicles mired constantly. Supply lines stretched thin as everything had to be hand-carried forward through zones of continuous artillery fire. Private First Class Jacqueline Lucas of the 1st Battalion, 26th Marines, had lied about his age to enlist at 14 and reached Iwo Jima still only 17 years old. On February 20th, during an assault on enemy positions, 2 enemy grenades landed in his squad's fighting hole. Lucas threw himself on both grenades, absorbing the explosion with his own body. Miraculously, 1 grenade had wedged into volcanic sand, directing most of its force downward, and Lucas survived despite severe wounds. He became the youngest Marine to receive the Medal of Honor and the youngest serviceman in the Second World War to receive the decoration. By February 25th, the Marines had captured Airfield No. 1 and were pushing toward Airfield No. 2. The advance averaged approximately 200 yards per day, each yard purchased with casualties. Fresh troops from the 3rd Marine Division entered the battle to relieve exhausted units from the initial assault divisions. The pattern of combat remained constant. Identify a defensive position, call for supporting fire, assault under covering fire, destroy the position with explosives or flame, move forward to the next position. Marine Corps doctrine had evolved significantly since the early island campaigns. The integration of tanks, flamethrowers, demolitions and infantry into combined arms teams represented sophisticated tactical coordination. Sherman tanks equipped with flame projectors replaced their main guns with enormous flamethrowers that could reach 75 yards. These tanks advanced with infantry support that protected them from magnetic mines and close assault. Engineers followed to demolish destroyed positions permanently, preventing their reoccupation. First Lieutenant Rufus Geddy Herring led his platoon from Company A, 1st Battalion, 28th Marines in repeated assaults against fortified positions during the advance north. On February 27th, his unit encountered a complex of bunkers that had stopped the advance. Herring personally led a demolition team against the positions, exposing himself to enemy fire while placing explosive charges. His actions allowed the advance to continue, but he was lost to enemy fire before seeing the position's destruction. His leadership exemplified the small unit commanders whose decisions shaped the battle's outcome at the tactical level. The arrival of the first damaged bomber on March 4th provided tangible evidence of why Iwo Jima mattered strategically. A B-29 superfortress named Dynamite, returning from a bombing mission over Japan with battle damage and fuel running low, made an emergency landing on the partially repaired Airfield No. 1. The massive aircraft touched down safely, its crew of 11 men avoiding ditching in the ocean. Over the following months, more than 2,400 emergency landings would be made on Iwo Jima, saving nearly 25,000 aircrew members from death or capture. The island's strategic value validated the operation's cost in a way no theoretical planning could match. As March progressed, the Marines ground northward into the island's roughest terrain. The Meat Grinder, an area containing 3 prominent terrain features designated Turkey Knob, the amphitheater, and Hill 362A, cost thousands of casualties to secure. Each feature proved to be a complex of mutually supporting positions that required days of close combat to reduce. The 3rd Marine Division committed its regiments into the battle, and still the Japanese resistance continued. Lieutenant Colonel Justice Chambers commanded the 2nd Battalion 25th Marines through some of the fiercest fighting. On March 1st, his battalion assaulted Hill 362A, the highest point in northern Iwo Jima. The fighting lasted 2 days, with Japanese defenders using the broken terrain to launch close-range counterattacks and then disappearing into tunnel systems. When the hill finally fell on March 2nd, only 150 Marines from Chambers' original battalion of 900 remained fit for duty. Navy Corpsman Pharmacists Mate First Class John Bradley moved through the chaos of combat, providing medical care with quiet efficiency. The corpsman from Wisconsin had been part of the patrol that raised the 2nd flag on Suribachi. Now in the meat grinder of northern Iwo Jima, he repeatedly exposed himself to enemy fire to reach wounded Marines. On March 6th, a Japanese grenade severely wounded Bradley, ending his combat service. His actions throughout the campaign earned him the Navy Cross, but he never considered himself heroic, only doing his job. The Japanese garrison fought with a discipline and determination that impressed even their enemies. Cut off from reinforcement or resupply, aware that no possibility of evacuation existed, the defenders continued executing Kuribayashi's defensive plan. Small groups emerged from tunnels at night to probe marine lines and gather supplies from the dead. Artillery fire continued from positions that had supposedly been neutralized days earlier, the guns having been moved through tunnels to new firing points. By March 10th, organized Japanese resistance had contracted into the northern tip of the island. Kuribayashi moved his command post to a cave system near Kitano Point, abandoning his original deep bunker near Suribachi when it became isolated. The general sent a final message to Tokyo on March 16, reporting that the garrison had fulfilled its duty and inflicted maximum casualties on the enemy. He expressed no regret except that Iwo Jima could not be held longer. The island was declared secure on March 26th, 36 days after the initial landing. The declaration was largely administrative, as pockets of Japanese resistance continued for weeks afterward. Kuribayashi himself perished sometime in late March, the exact circumstances unknown. His body was never conclusively identified. Some reports suggest he led a final assault against Marine positions near Kitano Point on March 26th. Other accounts indicate he ended his own life to avoid capture. The general who designed the Impregnable fortress did not survive to see its fall confirmed. The American casualties exceeded all predictions. 6,821 Marines and Navy personnel were killed in action. 19,217 were wounded. Approximately 900 died of wounds later, bringing total deaths to over 7,700. The casualty rate approached 35% of the landing force, the highest of any Marine Corps operation in the conflict. 27 Medals of Honor were awarded for actions on Iwo Jima, more than any other single battle in American military history. 13 recipients received their medals posthumously. The Japanese garrison virtually ceased to exist. Of the 21,000 defenders, fewer than 1,000 survived to be captured, and most of those were laborers rather than combat troops. The garrison suffered approximately 98% casualties, fighting essentially to the last man as Kuribayashi had ordered. The general's tactical concepts proved sound, and had the Japanese possessed similar defensive positions on other islands, the Pacific campaign's cost would have escalated dramatically. The operation's strategic value emerged clearly as the air campaign against Japan intensified. Fighter aircraft based on Iwo Jima provided escort for bombers all the way to their targets over Japan, dramatically reducing bomber losses. The island's radar sites provided early warning of Japanese air attacks against the Mariana Islands. The emergency landing field saved thousands of aircrew members whose aircraft could not return to distant bases. These practical benefits justified the operation's cost in ways beyond the purely theoretical planning calculations. For the Marines who survived, Iwo Jima represented both a tactical victory and a traumatic experience. Veterans of the campaign carried physical and psychological wounds for decades. Many struggled to articulate what they experienced on the volcanic island. The intensity of combat, the losses among friends, the grinding nature of the advance against an enemy who would not surrender, all combined to create memories that defied easy communication to those who had not been there. The famous photograph of the flag raising became a symbol that transcended its specific moment. 3 of the 6 flag raisers toured America selling war bonds, their image reproduced on posters and stamps. René Gagnon, Ira Hayes, and John Bradley found themselves elevated to celebrity status they neither sought nor felt comfortable accepting. Hayes, a Pima Indian from Arizona, particularly struggled with survivor's guilt and public attention, eventually succumbing to alcoholism. The photograph had captured a moment of apparent triumph, but the men in it knew too well what triumph had cost. The battle challenged assumptions about military operations on both sides. For the Japanese, Kuribayashi's defensive methods validated the concept of defense in depth, but also demonstrated that even perfect defensive positions could be overcome by an enemy with overwhelming resources and determination. For the Americans, Iwo Jima proved that victory was possible against any fortification, but forced a recognition that such victories required accepting casualties that would have seemed unthinkable in earlier conflicts. Tactical innovations from Iwo Jima influenced military thinking for decades. The combined arms techniques developed to reduce fortified positions became doctrine. The importance of flamethrowers, demolitions, and close infantry-tank cooperation shaped equipment development and training. The battle demonstrated that technological superiority alone could not guarantee victory. Victory required skilled small unit leaders, determined infantry willing to close with the enemy, and supporting arms coordinated at the tactical level. The volcanic island itself recovered slowly from the devastation. The black sand beaches, churned by combat and scarred by fortifications, gradually returned to their natural state. The airfields that cost so much to capture were maintained by American forces until the conflict's end and then returned to Japanese control. Mount Suribachi's slopes, once honeycombed with defensive positions, eroded naturally over the decades. Today, the island is open to visitors, with monuments marking significant locations and remembering both American and Japanese service members who fought there. Survivors from both sides occasionally return to Iwo Jima for remembrance ceremonies. Former enemies who fought to annihilate each other met as old men to honor shared sacrifice. The reunion of combat veterans, regardless of which flag they served, acknowledged a common experience that transcended national boundaries. They had participated in something extraordinary, a battle that tested human endurance and tactical skill to ultimate limits. The strategic question of whether Iwo Jima justified its cost remained debated for years. The 2,400 emergency bomber landings provided concrete justification. The fighter escort missions from the island reduced bomber casualties on later raids. The psychological impact of capturing an island the Japanese considered part of their homeland proper affected Japanese civilian morale. Yet the operation's 19,000 casualties, occurring late in a conflict whose outcome seemed increasingly certain, raised questions about whether alternative strategies might have achieved similar results at lower cost. Historical analysis ultimately concluded that Iwo Jima represented a necessary operation that achieved its strategic objectives despite horrific costs. The island's location made it invaluable for supporting the air campaign against Japan. The Japanese garrison, if bypassed, would have threatened communications and conducted air attacks against the Mariana Islands bases. The operation's tactical lessons influenced planning for subsequent operations, potentially saving lives in later campaigns. The battle exemplified both the tremendous cost of defeating a determined enemy in prepared positions and the capability to achieve victory when national will supported military operations regardless of price. The flag-raising photograph, reproduced countless times, became embedded in American cultural consciousness. The Marine Corps War Memorial in Arlington, Virginia, recreated the image in bronze towering over visitors with its depiction of 6 men raising the flag. The memorial's inscription reads, in honor and memory of the men of the United States Marine Corps who have given their lives to their country since 10 November 1775. The specific moment captured by Joe Rosenthal's camera became a symbol for something larger than itself, representing service, sacrifice, and determination across generations. For the families of those who fought on Iwo Jima, the battle's memory carried forward through generations. Children grew up knowing their fathers had participated in something significant, even if those fathers rarely discussed their experiences. The flag raisers' families found their lives forever altered by association with the famous photograph. The families of those who died received folded flags and official notifications, but the meaning of those deaths on a volcanic island halfway around the world sometimes remained difficult to process. The battle's legacy extended into how military forces trained for combat. The integration of different weapons systems into combined arms teams became standard doctrine. The emphasis on small unit leadership and initiative, crucial to success in the broken terrain of Iwo Jima, shaped infantry training for decades. The recognition that fortifications alone could not guarantee defense led to evolving concepts about defensive operations. The Japanese experience validated the effectiveness of defense in depth, but also demonstrated that defense without hope of reinforcement or counterattack ultimately meant accepting destruction in exchange for inflicting maximum casualties. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.